alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, ICCC. MashaAllah, alhamdulillah, we're good to have you. Good to see, MashaAllah, all youth. Hey guys, listen, you are here for a special event. I would like you to pay attention. I would like to move closer so Imam can see you, you can see him. Don't sit in the chair for the old people. You, MashaAllah, young guys, come here. Please fill up the front safs. I ask everybody, you don't need a wall right now. When you get to my age, then be looking for the walls, okay? So please move. It won't be that long. It's a few minutes. Sister, you welcome, come front on these rows so you can be here close by us, okay? I will humbly request to the parents, keep the kid by you so they shouldn't be running around so we can concentrate our program. And after that, Brother Muheez is here. He is ready for any QA. But before we go further down, first you have to listen carefully. So, alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair, bismillah, we start the program. Jazakallah.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So in the Parsippany School District tomorrow, we have something called Pride Day, right? And Pride Day, June, if you don't know, is known as Pride Month. It was called Pride Month by Clinton himself. So this isn't something very new. And actually, Pride Day itself specifically is on June 28th. Now, the irony of it being on June 28th is that it's outside of school day, right? So it's technically the summer. So hence, the school systems, they try to push it earlier into June. Now, the topic of my conversation obviously is going to be around this whole concept of pride, specifically LGBTQ. But one of the things that really intrigued me is that if you look at this concept, it's very new, right? It doesn't feel like it was there for the last even few years. And so having the thought of, how do these modern movements come to light, right? Where did this agenda from LGBTQ even start? Now, most of us, we approach it from the Quranic lens and we try to speak about it, how it's forbidden in Islam. And most of us, we already understood that. But when we think critically about any subject, one of the things we must realize is that even between theological debates, I'll give you an example, right? Even if you talk about the Deobandi or the Barelvi movement in northern India in the 1850s to the 1900s, right? Even if you look at that concept, you think these concepts are based off of theological base, right? Differences in opinions, differences in fiqh, etc. But really, the origination of these schools came from what? It came from British colonization. Before that, for over hundreds of years, Muslims lived in India, but yet nobody discussed these topics until their threat to their society or their culture happened, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these discussions, it might seem as though it is because of one cause, but rather the true origination of a lot of these movements is rather political based. And this is really important to understand because you have to think about it. Just in 1960, right, or even earlier than that, there's a specific president. If you look at the entire gay movement, right, even from like the 1900s, even just up until 2010, 2014, they didn't even allow anybody who was classified as gay, lesbian, whatever it is, to even enter the military, right? And then how is it that 12 years later, the whole country is celebrating such an event? And so a lot of these things are political based. And so how does something become law, right? There's a channel system on how it happens. Essentially, it first starts with unbridled desires. So people have a desire for a specific thing. And then over time, that desire gains traction and it becomes part of culture, right? So it starts to become a norm into culture, and then eventually after it becomes a norm in culture, it becomes a law. Now, ultimately, the political reason for this is just to get votes, just to get people to side with them because of obviously this agenda, and now it's become something called culture. And culture in modern times is very important to understand because culture is something that is so rapidly changing all the time. And if you look at this entire LGBTQ movement, you can ask yourself, how did it start in America, right? Because this concept it is actually, the term even homosexuality did not even become a term until 1860. Prior to that, there was no word in the English dictionary for homosexuality. Even if you look in Arabic, and obviously now we have a translation for it, but there was no word to translate to homosexuality. So it is something that we call a new invention. And actually, the political reason why homosexuality started, it was actually a revolt against the church, right? Very similar to the Protestant movement. Essentially, what you have is that you have this hierarchy that must be maintained in the Roman Catholic kind of perspective, right? So you have the commoner, then you have like the priest, and then you have the Pope, and then you have like God, essentially. And so what happens is that and this is how the West basically took religion out of, basically the term modernity comes from the fact that the West specifically took religion out of ethics. They took religion out of law. And so the effects of this were because of the fact that there was this hierarchy of systems. And so basically the word of the Pope became God, and the people, they did not have access to the true source of the knowledge. Hence, they were manipulated over many years. Long story short, this is this cause of the LGBTQ movement is originated from that. This entire Roman Catholic hierarchy system in which they manipulated the government, the religion, etc. This is all stems from that. Now, if you look at it from an Islamic perspective, obviously we know that homosexuality, such acts, they violate a moral integrity, right, that we uphold. And so one of the things that you might worry about, especially now that you've taken your kids out of the school system, let's say you don't bring them to school tomorrow, right? There's a high chance somebody's going to ask them a question on why didn't you come, right? Or you might get asked as a parent, why didn't you bring your kids here? Even in Canada, a teacher went on Facebook and she started to express her feelings about on how she called the Muslim parents from her community narrow-minded. She said that they preach hate, that they don't accept love, etc., etc. And so these things will happen. And actually, one of the things that people fear the most is this concept in today's culture. It's called cancel culture, right? In which that if you speak out against what the current cultural norms are, you will be blasted on social media, etc., because you are against their notion. Now, one of the things that you have to realize is that Islam will never be canceled. Islam is the only religion on this planet that will never be canceled until the end of time, because this is something that's held sacred by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. And we are those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls in the Quran Khalifa. We are those who pass down this banner of Islam from one generation to the next. And if you look at Islam in its roots, the way we recite today is the same way the Prophet ﷺ recited 1400 years ago. So when you might feel intimidated, number one, to speak out and speak for yourself and for your religion, but know that you can never be canceled. Your lineage doesn't trace back to the 1860s or the 1900s. Rather, your lineage traces back all the way to Adam alayhi salam. And so the number one thing we must realize is that we should never sell ourselves just to seek the happiness of other people, right? We do not violate our own moral and ethical codes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has withheld for us just because we want to appease somebody else. And commonly, right, people in today's society, they take what society says as their own religion, right? They take Hollywood and all these narratives to be their gods. And this is something you have to realize, because ultimately we will all serve other people in our life, right? If you look at it, if you compare a man, he serves his boss, right? If you take the woman, right, if she's working, she'll serve her boss, or she's serving her family, and same thing vice versa. The children, they're serving the parents, etc., etc. So ultimately, we all have to serve people, right? But in this path of serving others, the most important person that we serve is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so that's kind of where our guidelines start. Now, the thing in this LGBTQ movement, which is their most powerful phrase that they use against the average person, is that they say, love is love. They say love is love. And so one of the things that they say is that basically all we want to do is just live our lives the way we want to. We want to love who we want. We want to express how we feel, however we want. And the issue with that is that you open Pandora's box. Because when you say love is love, that's their current interpretation of what love is, right? That you can like the same sex gender. But the real issue with that is that it has no bounds then. So essentially, what if you saw a 40-year-old man walk into this room right now with a 12-year-old boy, and he says, I love this boy and I just married him? What would you say to that? And now this man will use the same argument. Love is love, right? You can't judge me now because I'm abiding to your standards and your rules. And of course, society initially will reject him, but you will see how this train of path eventually occurs. I mean, just look at it. People can say, don't call me a guy anymore. I'm a she now, right? And as ridiculous as it sounds, as stupid as it is, people actually acknowledge it. And now they have to call, so-and-so by the opposite gender. And so what I'm trying to say is that this term that they use, love is love, essentially they're opening Pandora's box. So if somebody comes to you with such a statement, you must give them the extreme version of what love is love means, right? And you can coin it in any way that you want. And so then they'll say, well, why do Muslims preach hate, right? And so obviously, because of the fact that we don't preach hate, that's definitely not what we do, but rather we tell them to stay within the ethical boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you, right? Whether you believe it or not or accept it. And so ultimately, even if you look at the story in the Quran of Lut alayhi salam, right? We all know the story of Lut alayhi salam and how his nation got destroyed because they were openly homophobic, right? And the issue with this is that when the angels came to destroy that nation, what happened? Who did they meet first? They met Ibrahim alayhi salam on their way to go see Lut alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam was a relative of Lut alayhi salam. And so eventually Ibrahim alayhi salam, he realizes that there's these three angels here. So he asks them, why are you here? And they say that we've come to destroy the nation of Lut. And what does Ibrahim alayhi salam do? He starts to tell the angels, give them more time. Maybe they'll change their ways. And the reason I bring this up is that you can clearly see from this example that Islam does not preach hate. Because had it done, Ibrahim alayhi salam would have said, yes, I've been making dua for this, the whole time. But no, rather he prays for the salvation of his people. So this is one important concept that we also must follow the sunnah of Ibrahim alayhi salam. That yes, we might live in this difficult world, but it doesn't mean that we stop praying for the good of others. It doesn't mean that we show hate to these people. Rather, we should be upholding the ethical standards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in place for us in the Quran. And even if you look at other examples of forbidden sins, for example, the concept of drinking alcohol, the Prophet ﷺ said that the person who drinks alcohol, he is cursed, right? And then what happens? One day, a man, he walks into the masjid and he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, and he tells the Prophet ﷺ, I love to drink and I can't stop it. And one of his companions, what does he do? His companion says, well, you're cursed by Allah. And then the Prophet ﷺ looks at his companion and he says, why would you do that? Just because this person is fighting their own internal desire doesn't mean you get to tell them that they're cursed people, right? Because then the man says, Ya Rasulullah, even though I commit this mistake, I still love you and I still love Allah, right? And so there will be people within even our own communities. And I'm trying to break this down in a way where you can answer questions that come from this community. You can answer questions that your children might be asked. But then I also want you to think of it from a religious perspective on how we can actually make a difference, right? And so these concepts, as difficult as they may be, the concept of sexuality in the Quran, and the reason, and at first I was looking at the population, I said, there's a lot of kids here. But then I also said to myself, they're even teaching them at a younger age than this, right? They're teaching them in kindergarten, in first grade, etc. So we must start talking about these things as well. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even hide these facts. Actually, if you look at the verses on the wall right behind you, there are 3 verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically says to guard one's chastity. And these are from Surah Al-Mu'minun, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, and they are those, this is one of the highest ranking qualities of a Muslim. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and they guard their chastity. They're constantly on top of guarding themselves. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extends the topic in the following 2 verses. But So the concept of homosexuality, it goes much further than that. And actually, if you look at the historical analysis in the United States, what was really the key trigger point that had this movement start? The key trigger point was actually contraceptives. Contraceptives were actually the key starting point when they created that pill. Because what it allowed people to do was they started to stop valuing the morality within families. And so what they made sexuality something that was that it didn't have to abide by marriage, right? So people were able to openly do it. And that was actually the catalyst in 1950. And then there was a movement in the 1960s where there was a sexual revolution called Gay is Good. And then in the 1970s, this LGBTQ community was able to hold their first ever Pride Parade. So it happened in the 1970s. Then in the 1980s, you had the AIDS outbreak, right? So people got scared. Essentially, AIDS is derived from homosexual acts. And then in the 1990s, there was an act that was that prevented people from the same sex to getting married. But really, what the first trigger point that really started this community was in early 2004. There is a specific law. It's called the Matthew Shepard Act. What happened to this man, Matthew Shepard, is that he was beaten and killed due to his sexual, preferences. And so what happened is that in 2004, they made it a law to prevent people who were gay to, if they were victims of sexual abuse or harassment, whatever it may be. So really in the early 2000s is when it started. And then in 2010, like I mentioned earlier, they removed the restrictions even within the military to prevent those who are homosexual to be allowed in the military. And then in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court actually legalizes the same-sex marriage in all 50 states. And then 2016, you also have the shooting in the gay club. I don't know if you remember that, but it happened in Florida. And then most recently, the president and the vice president, they partook in this gay pride event along with the Prime Minister of Canada. So you can see that how it started to where it is now, it doesn't really make sense. But one of the other things that somebody from this community, what they will say is that it's my body, right? I'm free to do whatever I want because it's my body. You have no right to tell me what I can do and what I can't do. If you look at this, the problem within Islam regarding this specific subject is that it's actually not your body, right? This body is actually very temporary, and it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loaned us. So that concept itself is invalid because there are so many factors in this life that we have no control over. We don't have any control over how we look. We don't have any control over what day we were born or what day we died. We don't have any control over majority of the things in our life that are super critical, like who our family is, etc., etc. So this concept is essentially that the world revolves around the human being. But rather in Islam, what we say is that no, everything revolves around Allah. Right? And so our theology, our even thought process is entirely different from A to Z. Because we don't see ourselves as a sole pillar of reality, we're able to have more ability to self-reflect, to understand other people, etc. And also be able to fight off our internal desires. Now, another question you can get is, why do Muslims even care? Why do Muslims even fight back? Or why do Muslims even talk about this on the pulpit, right? Why do they discuss such topics? Well, the reason is that we don't go and speak about these things to, investigate into other people's lives, nor do we care about your private lives. But rather, if you stick a banner in front of my face and you say this rainbow banner represents this community and you have to accept our theology, our motivation, our lifestyle, and you must accept it and you must also promote it, right? Then these discussions now enter into the public sphere. And if you look at it, Islam is the only religion that is actively against it in the United States. All other religions, even if you take this masjid that was a synagogue before, they had a unisex bathroom. Their priest or their rabbi was gay, right? I don't know if that's true here, but there's other communities. Even when I went to Parsippany High School, one of the people that I met, the priest, she was lesbian, right? And it doesn't make sense, right? I'm like, what are you doing, right? It doesn't make sense, but they are basically succumbing to the notion of their community. And so, while it's not our jobs to get into other people's private lives, it is our job to warn others against what's wrong and what's right. And that is a simple fact. And another thing that we have to take into consideration is the fact that when it comes to a lot of discrimination that happens in the United States, this community is one of the first communities to back and support all other minority groups. So the LGBTQ movement itself, they are always there to support Muslims, blacks, whatever religion it is. They're always the first ones there to support them and to make sure that they're not discriminated against. Now, because of this sole reason, social groups around the country feel obliged to help them out. And this concept, it's a very similar sales tactic. For example, if I give you $1 today, right? Then if you ask me for $5 tomorrow, I'm more inclined to help you because of the fact that you did me a small favor, and so I want to repay you back in a greater way. And so the human psychology is that if somebody helps you, you want to help them back in a greater way. But I want you to take this for example, right? In Europe, the legal age to drink alcohol is 16, and United States is 21. If somebody comes from Europe over to the US and they start challenging the law system and saying, no, we think that you should follow our way, etc., etc., is the US going to abide by it? No, right? Because of the fact that there's already so much harm happening to underage drinking, they will never change their standards just because some other country is doing it. And so similarly, we don't change our standards just because other people have lowered theirs, right? We don't lower our standards just because of that. And if you look at it, it's kind of a mafia-like mentality, right? I do you a favor, you do me a favor. And so the issue is that, we should never feel obliged just because somebody helps us out. We appreciate it, but we don't turn around and say, oh yeah, you know what, I'm going to help you with anything that you need as well, right? And this is not how favors work. Favors are not done for the simple reason that, hey, I'm going to do you a favor, now you owe me back. And so lastly, how serious of an issue is this, and how are they trying to attack the Muslim community? Last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago in Canada, they had a graffiti-like painting, right? And in this graffiti-like painting, they had two hijabis, and they were about to kiss one another. And the reason I mention this is that you might think that, oh, you know what, they're not doing anything to the Muslim society, etc., but they are specifically targeting us now because they know that we are the last layer of defense for this society, right? And so when they draw something like that, I'm telling you, there's a hidden agenda definitely behind it. They don't decide to put, now they could have put two men, right? But rather they put two women, and what? They also had what? The hijab on. And so that itself, brothers and sisters, I'm telling you, is a serious way of them trying to infiltrate the minds of especially our society. But I'm going to be honest with you, majority of us in here, we're all adults, right? We're not going to buy it. So how do they actually try to do this? They try to go and influence the youth rather than the adults. And if you have a good enough relationship with your child, you should ask them one question. How do you feel about this movement, right? And the reason I bring this up is because if you look at the statistics since 2010, or actually since 2019, 20% of movies have at least one gay character. In 2022, 2023, I'm sure that number is probably up to 80%. Any movie you see, my niece, she was watching this Power Ranger movie, right? It's on Netflix. She was watching the movie, and I was saying to my wife, I was like, I'm surprised they don't have a gay scene yet, right? And what happens? 15 minutes before the movie ends, right? They show a gay couple. I'm like, why did they have to do that, right? But they purposely have a quota now that has to be met. And so the most dangerous thing, right? You can obviously watch over what movies they're watching, but you don't know what books they're reading in school. If you remember at the start of the school year, back in September or August, I had a khutbah where I spoke about the gingerbread person, right? Essentially, commonly what we know as the gingerbread man, they transformed that as, oh, no, sorry, they called it the genderbread person. And so they took the gingerbread man, they took it, or they took his pronoun out, right? And they made him gender neutral. And this is actually being taught, this was actually first introduced by Imam Kaiser at Rutgers University. And this is in Edison, where there's a huge Muslim population. And his daughter, I think she's in first grade, she comes up to him and she says, like, guess what we learned about today, right? And he's like, what'd you learn? And she's like, the genderbread person. He's like, do you mean the gingerbread man? She's like, no, I don't know what that is, but we learned about the genderbread person. And if I actually would encourage you to Google it, because there's a high possibility that your children probably have seen it as well. And what I'm basically trying to get at is that they're using cartoons, they're using movies, they're using all this social media propaganda. If you look at Disney Channel itself, they have made it a goal that they will have some type of LGBTQ representation in every single show and movie. And they are one of the first companies that go out, especially like because they're based in Florida, right? With Disney World, etc. There's a huge debate between the Republicans in Florida versus Disney World. And it's actually very interesting to see, especially around the times during elections. But ultimately, how do you know what's going in the mind of your children? You must read the books that they're reading. You must ask them, how do you feel? You must bring up these topics that our parents never spoke to us about. Because if you don't, I'm telling you, somebody else is speaking to them about it, whether you like it or not. Teachers can do that. And so, brothers and sisters, we went through many different cases as to some of the history behind the LGBTQ movement. Why do we care? How is the Muslim community specifically being targeted from this movement? And how do you respond to a lot of the criticism, right? And so what I highly encourage everybody here to do is, number one, research and understand this on your own. Yaqeen Institute has about a 40-page document on this itself. Speak to your children about it, right? The last thing you want, and we see it so often, is that a parent will come to us and they will say that my child, they're struggling with, identity issues, or they have a boyfriend or girlfriend for the last 10 years and they don't know what to do with themselves anymore. Or my son or daughter, they're saying that they're gay or lesbian, etc., etc. So start these conversations in your homes. The best person to help fight it is you as a parent, right? And if you don't open that form of dialogue, that form of connection with your children, then I'm telling you, somebody else is going to speak to them and pollute their mind. And if your children might not see it in their life, just imagine what's going to happen to their children, right? It's like putting a Christmas tree in your house today and you're going to say, oh, you know what, my kids know not to worship, this tree, etc., and that, Jesus is the Son of God, whatever, Christmas. But imagine what's going to happen a couple of generations from now, right? Are your kids or are your grandkids or great grandkids, are they going to be Muslim? Are they going to be thinking about the same ideology that you do? Do they follow you? And this is something that Ibrahim alayhi specifically was constantly worried about. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those people who are able to stay united during these difficult times. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us and our children the ability to stay united on His path. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide our community and our fellow brothers and sisters around the world. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakallah khair for coming today. I would like to open it up for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, we can certainly talk about that. If not, thank you for coming. Inshallah. Any questions? Yeah.
Also mentioned that not make publicized, but we are
Right.
already publicized, we are doing the marketing, all the same stuff.
Right.
That's why we were saying that the approach for that was not trying to publicize them, trying to tell them, get in, I will treat you,
Right.
I will explain to you. I think this is something we should approach that instead of shouting, but I think we should somehow ignore, but they are knowing that we have to take action. That's how I think.
Right. there's another way to even approach it, and it's mentioned in the Yaqeen article. One of the ways that the LGBTQ community defends themselves or they shield themselves is they actually use this phrase LGBTQ. And so in the Yaqeen article, they actually say that you shouldn't identify them by this anymore, rather because they've stolen these letters. But what you should rather do is call them by their act. You should call them, people who like others of the same sex, etc. So now they can't hide behind this banner, this rainbow, these letters, but rather you're actually exposing them for the act rather than justifying it as a group of people. I think that the brother's question is, at what age should we start speaking to our kids? I think the thing is that they're speaking to our kids in first grade about it, right? Yeah. If you look at the genderbread person, that's it's a very like cartoonish type figure, or there's something else called the gender unicorn art. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's starting in early elementary school. Now, one of the things that you can actually identify is that New Jersey is one of like the select states that has actually I mentioned it in my khutbah back in September, but there's an actual letter from the Board of Education from in New Jersey in which they talk about the agenda of how much a child should be exposed to this concept of gender fluidity and homosexuality, right? LGBTQ, we'll just call it by that for short right now. And basically, I'm pretty sure it starts in first grade. And so between first to fourth grade, there's a specific agenda. Then fifth to eighth grade is another agenda. And then ninth to 12th, there's another realm that like all schools. Now, so it's written document that it must be taught at the start of first grade all the way up until the end of high school. How specific each district gets is dependent on the school system and the teacher. So there's no official thing that says that your children have to read these books, et cetera, by every grade, every year. Could it come to that in the coming years? I do think so. That they will have a standardized curriculum for LGBTQ, this whole narrative, but definitely around first grade. And if we even discussed this very intensely in our Saturday school program, we actually started it with our students from 7th grade and up, in which there's 3 yearly mental health workshops. So we actually have our professional sister Pashmina. She actually leads these, and obviously we speak about it in the classes too. But there's 3 dedicated seminars that also discuss this. So as a parent, and if you realize, I don't know if any of your kids are in our Saturday school program, one of the things that I actually instituted this year was the concept of reading books at home, right? And the main reason I had this agenda was to close the gap between parents and their children. One of the common things that you see that's a failure to majority of weekend schools around the country is the fact of the matter that most parents don't really care what their children are learning about. They just drop them off. Even in our Saturday school, like you see, majority of the parents don't even come to pray Dhuhr Salah. It's ironic because you're sending your kid here, you're picking them up in the parking lot, but you're refusing to come inside and pray. So obviously our actions has a big influence on their actions as well. But long story short, even if you don't feel that comfortable speaking to them about it, one of the things that you should definitely do is just open the doors of communication, i.e. reading books, etc. And the key reason behind that is that you want your kids, like, not just to enjoy reading with you, but you want them to make you feel as though you're a source of knowledge for them. That when they speak to you, they don't fear you, but rather they see you as an endless ocean of knowledge for them. So they feel comfortable going to you when they don't know. And that's really the thing, right? Because it's not just about this movement, but it's about how do I get my children to speak to me so I can guide them in the right way. And so there's a lot of different initiatives you can take, but the best one would be how the first revelation started, and that's Iqra, read, recite, and make it something common in our households to have that open dialogue. And inshallah, hopefully you might not even directly need to address it, but maybe they come and speak to you about it one day based on their questions. Yes. Right. Well, I think specifically tomorrow they were doing. Sister Lamia would know better. I don't have any kids, so I wouldn't know what's exactly. Okay. Okay. So the brother. What did you say? The This is in Montville. Yeah. It's unfortunate. They took away like all these colors and stuff. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. 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 It's very subtle. Sister Lama, you were asking? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you see, again, they're opening Pandora's box, right? Because they're basically saying that it's in their DNA. And the issue with that, like I gave you the example of love is love, right? Would you ever want to see like a 40-year-old man walking with a 12-year-old boy and saying that I'm going to marry him, right? It would feel so uncomfortable. And so, same thing, you can also take that same extremist example and you can say that, well, if it's in your DNA to be gay, if you were born gay, then a murderer in the future can say the same thing. It's in my DNA. I was born that way, right? So again, it's opening Pandora's box. That's number one. That you open the doors to anything, and once you do that, then there's no law, right? And even one of the things that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says in the Quran is that one of the reasons why there's a downfall in every single nation is because, and this is specifically mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah Subhanahu wa Taala talks about the concept of publicizing our sins, right? Because in history, it's always been a private sin, right? We know this concept, this struggle, lust in general, is a private matter. But once you have opened the doors to make it public, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about some of the actions that Bani Israel did in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah says that it wasn't necessarily their actions, but it's the fact that they started to publicize their actions. And from that, when we start to publicize the action, then it's very hard to get forgiven because how you are influencing others. Now, going back to your other question, what was it again? Right. Right. So I think, I mean, ultimately, if you take the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and so I feel like there's conversations that need to happen at multiple levels for this type of stuff to occur. One, I feel as though like maybe parents, as parents in the school system, you need to speak to the guidance counselors as well about this. But I believe, and the way you can structure this is because this is their narrative, right? This is the narrative that they're trying to paint, that essentially that if you don't support these kids, they're going to go through depression, they're going to have mental illnesses, etc., etc. They can't do anything about it, which is false, right? Because the whole concept of lust and desires is a entirely nafs related issue. So one, there needs to be a conversation to the guidance counselors. On top of that, you have to realize a lot of parents are also being manipulated that nowadays in this similar sense. Most parents around this world do not have the ethical guidelines and standards that Islam, gives us, right? And so we have a solid foundation. Whereas you have this parent who doesn't understand any concept of ethics and morality. How do they go up to their children who's been exposed to Bud Lightyear, SpongeBob, Sesame Street, where they're showing all types of LGBTQ stuff? And now that child, the only thing that obviously now they're getting brainwashed, right? This is a rainbow, but no, this is how people actually feel. So ultimately, if they use the stance of trying to make us feel guilty, right? It's the same example of them doing us a favor and then expecting a favor in return. Is that ultimately, as at a certain point, we have to say that you can even give them the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Whether it matters to them or not, you can tell them, look, in the Quran, this is what happened to the nation of Lut, and they know of the story of Lut. But you can say, look, this is how Ibrahim alayhi salam spoke to the angels when they told him that they were going to destroy this nation because of their public acts of indecency. And then, okay, just one second. And then you can say that, listen, we don't preach hate, but rather we do not accept this as our guideline. Whether or not you want to use this narrative to make us feel guilty, it's not going to change anything. Ultimately, there's a certain line that you basically say, we don't cross this line. Now, there are other ways to handle mental illness issues, but if you want our support, this is not how we can do it. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, right. How do kids respond to why didn't you come, right, to school? And so this, a lot of this, your kids are not going to be able to answer this just from listening to my lecture, right? You're going to have to open up these conversations, and you're going to have to explain to them that being Muslim puts you in an awkward situation since the Prophet ﷺ, or all prophets, right? We've never been the people to just naturally fit into society. We've always been the ones who have spoken up. And the reason for that, and for the kids in this room, to explain to you the psychology of religion itself, why do most people reject religion in general? The reason they reject it is because religion calls for what? Starts with C. Change. Religion calls for change, right? So it calls you to a state of discomfort initially, right? And then you finally realize that rather this discomfort, this type of discipline that this religion is teaching you is actually better for you. So for a child, the biggest thing is that a parent has to be involved in, and this is one of the things that I said in the parents' orientation at the start of the Saturday school year. And I told them that essentially you must be the people who are interacting with your kids on a day-to-day basis. The reality that we grew up in is entirely different than what our children are being exposed to today. When we were growing up, it was about drugs, alcohol, getting people pregnant, right? This thing was called DARE. There was a program, DARE, and it preached against these things. Now they have programs that preach against what we believe in, right? They preach for these things. And so as a parent, I mean, ultimately, right, you're here maybe for an hour today. You bring maybe, if your kids go to the weekend school, they're here for 2 hours in the entire week. But majority of the conversations that they have is either in school or at home, right? And children, the biggest things with them that especially that I see on a day-to-day basis is that there is an identity crisis, right? I don't know if you remember growing up, but how your culture at home was definitely different than the culture your friends had, right? And so you might have been embarrassed of your friend's culture in front of your parents, and you might have been embarrassed of your culture in front of your friends, right? And the reason for that is because these conversations were not being spoken about in our households when we were younger. We weren't taught about how to balance our cultures. This is why they do this. This is why we do that. If you feel uncomfortable, you can come and speak to me, etc., etc. The issue now is that it's not just a cultural thing. It is really the identity and the mentality that our children are being challenged with in very subtle ways, right? This is a rainbow. This is a this. This is a that. 10 years from now, he's not going to find any issues with this. He's going to say love is love, right? And so the biggest thing is that you need to support your children when it comes to these type of issues, and you must prepare them that you're going to have some discomfort. People are going to ask you questions that you might not like. And how are you going to answer these questions? And this is a simulation you can run through at home with your children, and you can see how they respond, and then you can help them kind of guide them in their answers, inshallah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is actually a very good statement. So basically, the brother said that a lot of other religious groups, such as the Jewish community, the Christian community, they're against this. So what are they doing? And how can we join in on this, right? Um, I don't. So I'm gonna approach it from two ways. The first way is that you can take the example of the southern states, right? So the number one thing is that the law comes through the governor. So who you elect as governor has a significant influence on the educational system, right? If you know the Democrats' like point of view, they're always going to be in favor of this LGBTQ stuff. I'm not saying you should vote for Democrats or Republicans, okay? I cannot do that from this podium. It will violate the 501c status of this masjid. But rather, so you must understand there's a political agenda, right? So if you look at majority of the southern states, Midwest states, they're all Republican. So there's heavy pushback from these states, and specifically they made sure that it is never going to be incorporated in their law. So that's number one from a higher level perspective. So I don't know who you voted for, but inshallah, whoever you voted for, you'll see the effects of it. And secondly, the question is how do we unite amongst other communities? That is something that we started to discuss, right? I believe Sister Lamia. So I addressed Sister Lamia because she's very active in the community, her and her family. So was there any discussion about? Yeah, go ahead. Right. Right. Right.
And they can tell that what is the first thing? Against the norms of
Right.
that
And before you speak on that, so Sister Lamia, the person she spoke about from the Board of Education. So there's something I want to talk about in terms of the Board of Education. If you remember during elections, what was it in October or November? Basically, every year they have. So there's 9 Board of Ed members, right? So out of the 9, every year 3 are being reelected. And what happens during this re-election is that obviously there's like multiple candidates, and they try to group together and they try to pull together to be. It's kind of like how the politics system work, right? You find people who have the common interests as you, and then everybody votes for like this group of people. And one of the crazy things is that out of like the 7 board members that were running in November, 4 of them had very conservative views. And when they came to this masjid during Jummah, I was speaking to them in the back, and one of the brothers, his name is Jack. He's a very good brother. He actually advocated a lot for us to have off for Eid as well. And I was speaking to him. I was speaking to a couple other members in his group, and they were all. And one of the reasons they wanted to join the Board of Education is because they wanted to keep these conservative values, right? And so the reason I bring this up is that we must know who's running for these type of elections. Obviously, if you see me, I'll tell you, right, who to vote for. I mean, who I would vote for right now, who to vote for. Obviously, I can't say that from here, right? But I would tell you what the views of these people are, and you would know. Now, the sister that she's talking about, she also backed us up for Eid. Okay, this is the irony. She backed us up for Eid. They want people to learn about Ramadan in the school system. So they're approaching it from a very wide spectrum, right? So you have to be sensitive kind of in understanding like what they're doing. But ultimately, you know, they're, what they learn in school has to be agreed upon by majority. So at least 5 out of the 9 people on the Board of Education have to know or have to agree on a specific book to be read. And so one of the things you can do from a voter perspective is that you actually have influence as to what the kids are going to learn in school based on who you're voting for, right? And then you advocate amongst yourselves on who you believe is the right candidate or the fit candidate to take this position. But I'm telling you, and it's crazy, but a lot of the people who are Christian, Jews, it doesn't matter. I believe it's more so the mindset of how people were raised that really makes a difference. Brother.
questions that might come along. Just I appreciate that. Probably gonna ask you a question. I simply said, our tradition are very, very aligned, similar, traditional, real Christian, have the same idea, and basically concept of being the sin, but loving man, love people, love, back then against the fear, but love people, pray for their guidance, salvation, so that was one thing. Backwards to forward a little bit. Now, at the conference, that one of the speakers from Texas said that he attended Lonnie's interview. He said that the rabbis and the priests they basically said to him, listen, you're our last line of defense. They said, we've sold out. We've kind of, come to the discussion. They said, you take the lead. I will support you. But they really are looking at they're looking for
Yeah.
it is the last line of defense.
Any other questions? There's one last thing I would like to end on, and that is the concept of modernity, right? And this is really a big thing in how the West portrays Islam, especially the East, right? If you look at it, they say that the Islamic values, they're very primitive, right? They're very unethical, that it's very backwards, very old, etc. And one of the things that we have to do as parents, right? A lot of us are from the Indian, Pakistani region, Turkey, North Africa, Africa, whatever it may be. You must also learn your own rich tradition and history, right? If you look at the golden age of Islam, if you look at the mosques in Spain, in Turkey, in Baghdad, and you learn about their history from the time of the Prophet ﷺ till probably the 1500s or the end of the golden age, you will see that Islam, they were the leading innovators in the world. And this is commonly things that we are not taught. We are not taught to appreciate our culture, our religion, what we came from, where we came from. You know, there's a famous poet, Allama Iqbal, and he's known as the father of Pakistan. And one of the things that he constantly talks about in his poems, especially in the late years of his life, he talks about a specific poem of when he first went to Spain and he saw the masjids in Spain, Masjid al Qurtuba to be exact. And he looked at it and he was he was so in awe of this masjid. And he said that our people built this 800 years ago, 900 years ago. We were at the peak of civilization. What they're doing now is nothing compared to the art, the beauty, the theology, everything that lived and breathed in Spain. The kings, the queens, they would send their children to Spain to go learn. They would send their children to Baghdad to go learn. They would have them go learn tradition, ethics, law, everything from the Muslim nations. And so I want to end with this, is that don't allow your children to feel as though this concept of modernity and to be adaptive and to understand and to innovate is something that came from the West. Rather, it was originated from Islam. And they took that in Europe. And Allama Iqbal, when he speaks about his poems of what he sees in Europe, he says this is the entire Islamic system that has kind of built this country. And even the leaders of France, they used to say, we wish that the Muslims took over France just as though they did Spain, because our country would have turned around much quicker. And so I'll end with this, is that we must teach our traditions, we must teach our religion, we must have these open dialogues, and we must continue to meet like this, inshallah. And if you have any questions, you can definitely find my number, you can definitely find Brother Adam's number. Or for the sisters in the back, I highly encourage you to meet with Sister Lamia, attend the Board of Education meetings. It's something that we constantly strive and struggle to get people to come. But with that being said, Jazakallah khair, everybody. I know it's getting really late. I think it was an important discussion. I hope everybody was able to benefit from tonight. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep our hearts united and to stay firm on this path. I think Isha is starting soon, right? So
Yeah, 25.
okay, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We have only